May I speak in the name of the one who is always coming towards us. Please be seated. Friends, welcome to the whiplash that is Palm Sunday. As Jesus entered Jerusalem, the crowd honored him and humbled themselves by spreading their coats and the leafy branches on the road and shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Only a few days later, the same crowd cried, "Crucify him." This morning, we wave our palms and then we stand when we read about his death so that we can remember that this story is not just about Jesus, it's also about us and what it means to be human. There's an Episcopal priest named Barbara Brown Taylor who puts it like this. She says, "There are so many parts to play in this story, and there's only one good guy in the whole bunch. All the rest conspire to do him in, either consciously or unconsciously, some of them by being weak, others by being cruel, some by being apathetic, and others by being zealous. They're all human, in other words. To be human is to know Jesus' side of the story, but to also know Judas' side, who betrayed him, and Peter's side, who denied him, and the chief priest's side, who interrogated him, and Pilate's side, who condemned him. To be human is also to know the crowd side, those who went along with the mob, and those who watched in silence and in fear from a distance." For a couple of months now, there's been a Bible study happening at the food pantry at St. Mary's on Tuesday afternoons. Folks can check in and get in line and then go to the Bible study. And a few weeks ago, Joe, who is leading the Bible study, was out of town, so I was the leader of the study. Now, as luck would have it, the assigned text that day was a really hard text. It was a parable in the Gospel of Mark between the two passages that we read today. And it's a parable often referred to as the parable of the wicked tenants. So in the story, the chief priests and the scribes have been asking Jesus about what authority he had to be teaching. And in response, Jesus told this parable about a man who planted a vineyard and left it in the care of tenants. In the story, the landowner sent a servant to collect his share of the harvest, but the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And this happened again and again with more servants that the landowner would send. And then finally, the landowner sent his own son, thinking that surely he would be respected, but the tenants killed him. So the folks in the Bible study and I wondered about this difficult story and why Jesus would tell it. And they seemed to agree that in the parable's metaphor, God was the landowner, and the Son was Jesus. And in telling it, Jesus was foretelling his own death. And I didn't say so, but I worried as I sat there about the possibility that anyone in the study might interpret the story in the way that God sends us into harm's way, sends us to places where we could be harmed. And as I sat there kind of stressing about how I might handle that, a woman in the group began to tell her story. With a calm and steady and quiet voice, she told us about unspeakable violence that she had witnessed as a child and that she herself endured as a young woman. In her home and in her family, where she should have been safe and loved, she was terrorized. And in her mind, she relives these experiences over and over again. She knows that because of her trauma, there's an anger and a violence that lives inside of her. She's aware of it. And it's just there even all these years later. But she has decided that the legacy of violence in her family ends with her. Whenever she has terrible thoughts, she prays. As it turns out, I did not need to tell her that God knows about her suffering or that God would never, ever will it. And I did not need to tell her that God was present with her or that God would sustain her and hold her up. She knew all of that already. She knew it in her bones, and that's how she can move forward. Though she was abused, she does not abuse. because Jesus is with her. Jesus who was abused and did not abuse. Jesus who suffered violence but brought peace. Jesus who was condemned but did not condemn. Jesus who suffered death but brings life. Needless to say, I was not the teacher in the Bible study that day. And I'll never think of that parable again the same way. The story that Jesus told with his words and with his life is that God does not will our suffering, but God will never stop entering into it, to be with us and to show us another way. Why would God do this? Why would God become incarnate and enter into the mess of this world? There is only one reason, and that's love. Human beings can be violent and cruel, apathetic and zealous, weak and fearful and selfish, and we can justify all kinds of violence moments after claiming Jesus as our King. And yet, despite the worst that we can do to one another, the one who made us loves us and will never, ever leave us. Along with our human frailties and failings, there is within us the image of the one who created us. The desire for peace and justice, commitment to standing with those who suffer, and the will to devote our lives to serving our neighbors. That's why my friend from the Bible study is able to carry on. Not because of her humanity, but because of the image of God within her. And because of the cross, which is both hideous and stunningly beautiful, we can know that when we come to the end of ourselves, when we suffer, when we fail, and when ultimately we die, God is there. When we come to the end of ourselves, God is there. The death of Christ was not the end, but the beginning, and so it is also for us to love him. This is the Palm Sunday truth that gives us strength for living and hope for dying. And all God's children said, Amen.